Bienvenidos and welcome to Fuengirola, one of the most popular seaside towns on Spain's always spectacular Costa del Sol. Frequented by tourists seeking the sun for more than 60 years, Fuengirola is renowned for its immense stretch of sandy beach. But there's also a lot of interesting history and things to see elsewhere in the town. And on this walk around Fuengirola on a gorgeous afternoon, we'll not only take a stroll along the Paseo, but also venture deep into the heart of this bustling town, where we'll catch a glimpse of Fuengirola's grand bullring, a collection of eye-catching churches, beautiful villas and more, before we then venture over the Fuengirola River to explore the more than 1,000-year-old Moorish castle which overlooks the town. All of that is to come over the next half hour. But we begin our walk in the place where everybody wants to be in Fuengirola, the beach. This is the town's main beach, known as the Playa de Fuengirola, and it's part of a seemingly endless stretch of sand that runs for more than 5 miles along Spain's southern coast. Though not too packed at the moment, this central section of the beach is usually busy with people soaking up the sun, playing games on the sand or swimming in the sea, with the town's many seafront restaurants and the busy Paseo just a stone's throw away. It's no wonder then that Fuengirola's idyllic beach is the town's main attraction, and we'll talk more about it before we venture into the heart of town. But as we get going on our walk, let's take a quick look at a map of Spain, to get a better understanding of exactly where this famous seaside town is. As you can see here, Fuengirola lies right in the heart of the iconic Costa del Sol, located roughly halfway between the major Andalusian cities of Malaga and Marbella. That central location makes Fuengirola one of the most attractive places to spend a holiday by the Mediterranean Sea. And just here behind the beach, we find an eye-catching statue dedicated to the Mediterranean itself. Known as Mediterránea, this sculpture by artist Luis Reyes was unveiled in 2003. And it depicts the strength of the Mediterranean Sea, showcasing a woman on a surfboard triumphantly riding the waves. Surrounding the statue, meanwhile, is what looks like a forest of palm trees, all planted on a small square known as the Plaza Teresa Zabel. The square is named after the Olympic sailor Teresa Zabel, who was originally born in the English town of Ipswich, but moved to Spain in her childhood, and who took her very first sailing lessons right here in Fuengirola, before going on to have a distinguished sailing career that included 2 Olympic golds while representing Spain. Now this square is just one of a number of intriguing features that you'll find all along Fuengirola's 5-mile-long Paseo, which is easily one of the longest seafront promenades in all of Spain. But not only is Fuengirola's Paseo one of the country's longest, it was also one of the most important in the development of Spain's famous tourist infrastructure in the mid-20th century. Laid out in stages during the 1960s, this lengthy promenade was the brainchild of Fuengirola's mayor, as the town was beginning to establish itself as a holiday destination, which was less geared towards attracting local Spanish tourists and more those from northern European nations, like the UK, Germany, Sweden and more. Within a few years, Fuengirola was one of southern Spain's most bustling tourist centres, with the brand new Paseo here one of its most popular features. And while this certainly wasn't the first of its kind in the country, it served as a model for many other tourist towns on the Costa del Sol, influencing the promenades in Marbella and Estepona, to name just a couple. But of course, everything we see around us on Fuengirola's seafront today is very new in the context of the town's lengthy history. And for centuries, Fuengirola simply came to an end where it met the beach, as there was historically little in the way of a major tourist industry. Originally, Fuengirola, like many other places along the Costa del Sol, began life as a small fishing village, first centred around the castle at the other end of the beach, but which gradually grew in size over the centuries. It wasn't until the early 20th century, however, that this historic fishing village began to turn its head towards tourism, with the arrival of the railways from Malaga in 1916 bringing in visitors from afar for the first time. And these were visitors who were often quickly enamoured by the sunny weather, the pleasant scenery, and the warm reception from locals. Cut forward just over 100 years to the present day, and Fuengirola is now a modern metropolis, with the beach lined by rows upon rows of tall apartment blocks, and the town home to more than 75,000 people, a far cry from its small and humble beginnings. Cut forward just over 100 years to the present day, and Fuengirola is now a modern metropolis, home to rows upon rows of tall apartment blocks that tower over the beach, and more than 80,000 people, a far cry from its small and humble beginnings. What's more is that more than a quarter of those 80,000 are people from overseas. Brits, Germans, Swedes, Finns, Danes, Irish people, and even a contingent of South Americans. And the vast majority of that population is concentrated in these apartment blocks all along the beach, at the bottom of which you'll find an endless array of cafes, bars, and restaurants, the perfect places for a meal and a sit-down just a stone's throw away from the Med. Fuengirola's seafront, therefore, is complete with all the ingredients that you'd expect for a quintessential holiday on the Costa del Sol. However, while relaxing on the beach and getting a bit of sun is absolutely the best thing to do on a visit to Fuengirola, when on holiday we often miss out on the chance to get to know the town and its history away from the beach a little better. So let's rectify that by venturing off the Paseo and into the heart of Fuengirola, where we're going to take a look around some of the town's oldest landmarks and see how local community life mixes with the flocks of international tourists who visit in their droves every year. Now, to give you a bit of context, we're here in Fuengirola at the end of March, so the streets are a little calmer than is the case during the peak summer months. That being said, even at this time of year, there's a nice energy both by the beach and in the town centre, and the weather's already above 25 degrees. So if you have the chance to visit in the early spring, then it's well worth it to avoid the busiest crowds and still get a good bit of sun. But in the summer, you're likely to find some very busy crowds walking along this street directly behind the seafront apartments. This is Calle Moncayo, popularly known in English as Fish Alley, and it runs for roughly a kilometre parallel to the Paseo, lined by pretty much every kind of restaurant and bar you could hope to find, many of course specialising in seafood dishes. Interestingly though, while tourists often call this street Fish Alley, it's known locally as La Calle del Hambre, Spanish for Hunger Street, simply because this was one of the first streets where so many local eateries, grocery shops and more were established in the 20th century. That was before many of the seafront apartment blocks were even built. But as we can see today, Fuengirola has exploded in size ever since foreign tourism began in earnest, with street upon street of hotels, restaurants and shops now stretching far back from the seafront and Fish Alley. Of course, as we know, Fuengirola wasn't the only Spanish town to see a dramatic rise in fortunes during the mid-20th century. In fact, between 1959 and the early 1970s, this entire country underwent a period of huge development that we now know as the Spanish Miracle. Tourism in coastal towns like this was a major driver of that miracle, with historically neglected seaside communities suddenly thrust onto the international stage, while Spain's big cities also saw a development boom as industrialisation took hold in what had until then been a still largely agrarian nation. Fuengirola therefore stands today as a symbol of the Spanish Miracle, but there's also plenty of older history to be found in the town too, such as here on the town's oldest and most central square, the Plaza de la Constitución. Originally laid out just under 200 years ago in 1841, the Plaza de la Constitución has changed significantly through its history. In fact, the only remaining feature from that time is the famous ficus tree just above us here, which is known as the Árbol de las Pelotillas. In the shadow of the square's oldest tree, meanwhile, we find one of its newest features, an eye-catching fountain built here in 2005, which, like the square, is named in dedication to the Spanish Constitution of 1812, the nation's very first constitution and one of the earliest in the whole world. You'll find many more Plazas de la Constitución around the country, but here in Fuengirola the square is a popular meeting spot for locals, featuring a blend of shade and sunshine, as well as one of the town's most splendid landmarks of all, the parish church of Our Lady of El Rosario. This towering white church was originally built back in the 1940s as the town centre shifted along the coast to this area, and it today exists as the spiritual heart of Fuengirola. Tourists can often pop inside and have a look around, but the church of course exists primarily as a place of worship for locals, as well as a focal point for many of the town's religious festivals throughout the year. Outside of the summer months, the best time to come to Fuengirola would have to be in early October, as that's when the town hosts the annual Fuengirola Fair, a historic celebration that's full of exciting events and traditional activities that you won't get the chance to see in the peak tourist season. Set around the religious feast of Our Lady of the Rosary, to whom the parish church here is dedicated, the Fuengirola Fair completely takes over the town at the beginning of autumn, with the Plaza de la Constitución here hosting musical performances, a grand flamenco mass, and a religious procession on the main feast day of the 7th of October. Elsewhere in town you'll find a huge fairground with rides, firework displays, live music concerts, and stalls selling traditional Andalusian treats. And of course, this being the Costa del Sol, the weather here is still pretty spectacular even at the beginning of October. So if you're looking to visit Fuengirola and soak up a bit of culture as well as sun, then that has to be the time to book your holiday. But let's now make our way off the central Plaza de la Constitución and onto Calle Marbella, yet another town centre street where you can find a seemingly infinite number of shops, restaurants, hotels, and more. This street takes its name from the fact that, in the direction we're walking now, it points towards the city of Marbella, which was historically an important destination for people passing through Fuengirola around 300 years ago. Back in the 18th century, alongside the smattering of small houses by the coast, you would have found one small inn in Fuengirola, which was known as La Venta, meaning the inn. For decades, this lone inn worked as a place of shelter that was specifically geared towards farmers, who were driving their mules across the southern coast of Spain towards the cities of Malaga and Marbella, where the mules would either be sold at market or used to carry goods back from the big cities to the countryside. Although, as we mentioned, the fishing village of Fuengirola was historically based around the castle a couple of miles along the coast from here, La Venta was the first major development in this area, and it was around that historic inn that a bustling community began to develop in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. By the 1820s, more than 1,000 people were living in this part of Fuengirola, which was beginning to cement itself as the centre of the modern town, a status only cemented by the building of the Plaza de la Constitución in the 1840s. So while Fuengirola today is home to a plethora of hotels, from simple apartments to 5-star resorts, we can look back to the humble legacy of mule herders staying at La Venta as genesis for this famous tourist town. Central Fuengirola, with its beach and many attractions, is of course a great place to spend all your time while on holiday on the Costa del Sol. But the town's central location also makes it a fantastic base to explore the region more widely. If you're looking to take a couple of day trips elsewhere in Andalusia, then there are plenty of places within easy reach of Fuengirola. Malaga and Marbella, both riveting and vibrant cities in their own right, are about half an hour away by car, while you can also head up into the mountains and visit the utterly gorgeous village of Mijas, home to a maze of higgledy-piggledy streets, traditional whitewashed houses, and exceptional views over Fuengirola, the Mediterranean Sea, and on extremely clear days towards the northern coast of Morocco too. But let's turn our attention back to Fuengirola, because just across this main road, we've stumbled across a small but intriguing square, the Plaza del Ayuntamiento, which means Town Hall Square. The building in front of us here, now a hotel, was once upon a time Fuengirola's town hall, and it was built all the way back in 1868, overlooking a square which is now also home to this striking modern statue of arguably the most important monarchs in the history of Spain, Queen Isabella I of Castile on the left, and King Ferdinand II of Aragon on the right, whose marriage all the way back in 1469 gave birth to the modern nation of Spain. Now, this brings us to an interesting point about the history of Fuengirola, Because while people have lived on this part of Spain's southern coast for over 2,000 years, it was only just over 500 years ago, after Isabella and Ferdinand's marriage, that this became a Spanish town with a Spanish name. Originally, Fuengirola was founded by the Phoenicians, possibly around the year 500 BC, before it was then settled by the Romans, the Visigoths, and then for the majority of its history, the Muslims. As you'll no doubt know, the vast majority of the Iberian Peninsula, encompassing what we now know as Spain and Portugal, was under Muslim rule for centuries, beginning around 1300 years ago in the 8th century. Fuengirola, located directly across the sea from North Africa, was close to the Muslim sphere of influence, and as such this area received heavy Muslim influence over the years, most notably as the town's Moorish castle towered over the settlement, and even lent its name to the area. During the period of Muslim rule, Fuengirola was known by the name Sohail after the castle, but in 1485, not long after Isabella and Ferdinand's marriage, Muslim rule here came to an end, as the castle was captured by Christian armies in the final stage of the Reconquista. We'll talk more about the Muslim heritage of this town when we visit the castle at the end of our walk. But it was after this point in history that Sohail came to be known by the Spanish name Fuengirola, a name which could be loosely translated as the Fountain of the Girona. Now the font in Fuengirola is thought to refer to a natural spring or fountain located at the foot of the old castle, while the Girola is thought to refer to a Girona, a kind of fishing boat that belonged to sailors all the way from Genoa in modern-day Italy, who are said to have regularly frequented this part of the Spanish coast to fish in the seas of the Mediterranean. Interestingly, the nets that were used by these sailors for fishing were known as boliches, which is the origin for the name of the modern district on the edge of Fuengirola known as Los Boliches, historically a separate fishing village, but today another lively part of town, packed with apartment blocks by the sea. With the establishment of La Venta in the middle, the former fishing villages of Fuengirola, Los Boliches and more have all today been unified into the large town of Fuengirola. And it's just here on the town's relatively new Plaza de España that we find the heart of government in this modern metropolis. While the old town hall back on the Plaza del Ayuntamiento is now used as a hotel, here we find Fuengirola's slightly less pretty but much larger modern town hall, which was opened in 2006 along with the grand new square that it overlooks here. Of course, as Fuengirola exploded in size throughout the late 20th century, the old town hall of 1868 inevitably became inadequate for the modern town's needs. But this 21st century Ayuntamiento is much better suited to this town of 80,000 people. And it's not the only modern development to have popped up in this corner of Fuengirola. Just along this street from the town hall, you'll find the History Museum of Fuengirola, which was opened back in 2003. Housed inside a modern building designed in the style of a typical Andalusian villa, the museum is filled with intriguing relics and exhibitions that detail the lengthy history of Fuengirola. Inside you'll find everything from centuries-old tools used by farmers in the local area to photos of the town in the early days of its tourist boom, and even an ancient Roman statue known as the Venus of Fuengirola, which was unearthed in the late 1970s in a nearby complex of Roman baths. As a plus, the museum is entirely free to enter, although the exhibits are only in Spanish, so do bear that in mind if you don't speak the language and fancy visiting. But the History Museum is far from the only place in town where you can get a clear idea of Fuengirola's centuries of heritage. Of course, there's the castle at one end of the beach, while at the other end, in the district of Los Boliches, you'll also find some fascinating excavations of a former Roman settlement that existed here around 2,000 years ago. Those Roman remains include the unearthed foundations of a Roman villa, a pottery workshop, a salt factory and thermal baths, all of which existed in a town that the Romans took over from the Phoenicians. As we mentioned, Fuengirola was founded around 2,500 years ago by the Phoenicians, who named their settlement here Cialis. When the Romans took it over a few centuries later, meanwhile, this place came to be known as Sohail, which was likely a settlement of moderate significance, as it was surrounded by a ring of defensive walls. Sohail was eventually abandoned after the fall of the Roman Empire, with the Visigoths and then the Muslims coming in before the Christians eventually arrived. Today, Fuengirola is peppered with Christian churches just like this one, the parish church of Nuestra Señora del Carmen, locally known as the Park Church, as it overlooks the town centre's main park. This church, as lovely as it looks, is actually even newer than the one we saw on the Plaza de la Constitución, built around 20 years ago to serve the ever-growing number of people living in Fuengirola. As we've mentioned, Fuengirola's population skyrocketed over the course of the late 20th century. In fact, there are more than 10 times as many people living in this town today than there were at the onset of the development boom back in the early 1960s. And as well as all of the apartments, the new town hall and more, a large number of new churches have also been built around town to cater to the influx of new residents. Another new development, meanwhile, is this delightful park, the Parque de España, which was also opened back in 2006 along with the new town hall, and which offers a nice oasis of quiet away from the busy seafront and beach. But let's continue making our way deeper into Fuengirola away from the seafront, because this part of town is home to a number of interesting spots that are well worth visiting when you've had enough of sitting on the beach. This relatively new parish church is of course one of those delightful landmarks, but just up this road you'll also find one of Fuengirola's most popular visitor spots, the zoo. Now known as the Fuengirola Biopark, this is more akin to a nature reserve in the heart of town rather than a typical zoo, with a number of habitats specifically designed to recreate the tropical environments of its animals, featuring everything from orangutans to chimpanzees, meerkats, lemurs, crocodiles, tigers, and a number of endangered species that you won't see in many other zoos around Europe. There has been a zoo here in town since as long ago as the 1970s, although it was in 2001 that this became a so-called biopark, which dedicates itself first and foremost to animal welfare. In slight contrast to the biopark, just across the road here we find Fuengirola's historic bullring, which has been an important venue in the town since it opened back in 1962. Built in a traditional style, the bullring here is big enough to host more than 4,000 spectators, and the venue is used to host not only bullfights, but also concerts, plays and more cultural events, including many of those which take place during the Fuengirola Fair in October. Currently under redevelopment in early 2023, Fuengirola's bullring remains a popular spot among locals, Andalusia being one of the areas of Spain with the greatest bullfighting heritage. And just here outside the bullring, in the middle of the roundabout, there also stands a statue of the bullfighter Antonio José Galán, who grew up here in Fuengirola and is one of the town's most famous former residents of all. Now, it's here just outside the town's bullring that we've come to the end of our tour around the heart of Fuengirola. But don't go anywhere, because we're now going to jump towards the Fuengirola River on the edge of town, where we're going to take a closer look at the more than 1,000-year-old Sohail Castle, where the original settlement of Fuengirola was based. Here, we find ourselves near the southern end of the town's lengthy Paseo, and just across the Fuengirola River here, we can see the mighty Sohail Castle atop a hill, on the edge of the modern town of Fuengirola. This is about a 20-minute stroll along the seafront from where we started our walk, and the castle is open to visitors for a few hours each day, usually between 10 AM and 2 PM, and that makes it a great place to visit in the morning before an afternoon of relaxation by the sea. In a couple of moments, we'll head up to the top of the hill on which the castle sits to get a closer look at the historic fortress, which is now connected to the rest of the town by this striking modern footbridge. Known as the Puente de la Armada Española, or the Spanish Navy Bridge, this bridge was opened back in 2006 to provide a direct seafront crossing of this wide river, the Fuengirola River. The river, which takes its name from the town of Fuengirola, is only short, running for just over 10 kilometers down from the hills of Mijas above Fuengirola. But as you'll see here by the seaside, its path is lined by yet more modern apartment blocks, all vying for a space as close as possible to the beach. The river does divide the town's famously long seafront walk, however. Although, thanks to this footbridge, Fuengirola's Paseo is now connected to the castle on the other side of the river, as well as the Playa del Ejido, a beautiful beach that sits in the shadow of the castle, and which is one of the most tranquil of all in Fuengirola. But arguably even more tranquil, and home to some of the very best views over the sea and the town as a whole, is the top of the hill on which the historic castle Sohail sits. So let's now head up there to get a closer look at this storied fortress. So, here we are on top of the castle hill, in one of the most spacious parks in town that offers a lovely vista over the quiet Playa del Ejido beneath us, as well as the glistening waters of the Mediterranean Sea. Now, we've talked enough about Fuengirola's sun, sand and sea over the course of this walk, but the castle that stands overlooking it all certainly isn't something to be missed, as by far and away the most impressive landmark of this town's pre-Reconquista history. As we mentioned earlier on, this castle is more than 1,000 years old, thought to have first been built back in the year 956 AD, when this area was under firm Muslim control. Known as Castle Sohail, the fortress was named after the original Roman settlement of Sohail, and the castle, as well as the civilian settlement surrounding it, were likely constructed on top of the ruins of that original Roman settlement, back in the mid-10th century. Now, despite having more than 1,000 years of history here on the edge of the modern town of Fuengirola, not every stone of Castle Sohail as we see it today is necessarily quite that old. The fortress's origins can be traced back to the mid-10th century, as that was when Abd al-Rahman III, the then Islamic Caliph of Cordoba, ordered the construction of a watchtower on a small hill overlooking the sea, in an effort to strengthen the defences on the southern coast of his caliphate. Around that original watchtower, he also ordered the development of a small civilian settlement, which gave birth to what's known as a kasbah, a fortified settlement that existed both for civilian and military purposes. But that original kasbah, known as an alcazaba in Spanish, was slightly different to the castle that we see now, as a couple of hundred years later in the 12th century, Castle Sohail began to take its current form, transforming from a slightly less fearsome fortified settlement into a major hilltop fortress, surrounded by the grand defensive walls which still stand today. Now, transforming Sohail from a kasbah into a castle was no whimsical decision. In fact, the development of the castle's stronger defences coincided with an era in which the Christian-led Reconquista was gradually gaining steam across Iberia, and the walls were to prove an essential protection to the rulers of Sohail a few centuries later, when the vast majority of Spain was back under Christian rule. In 1485, more than 500 years after Sohail was first born, the castle was captured by Christian armies of the Reconquista, Fuengirola becoming one of the last places in Iberia to be taken before the end of the Reconquista in 1492, just 7 years later. The battle to capture the castle was far from easy, however, and the original medieval fortress is thought to have been mostly destroyed in the conflict. The castle that we're looking at today, then, dating mostly from its reconstruction in the aftermath of that 15th century battle. Despite that, however, the current castle has seen its fair share of conflict over the last 500 years. Owing to its position directly on the sea, Castle Sohail is thought to have regularly fallen victim to raids by pirates, possibly even the legendary Barbarossa, or Redbeard. But in more recent centuries, Fuengirola's historic castle has still found itself in the crosshairs of conflict, most notably in the Battle of Fuengirola, which took place back in 1810 during the Spanish War of Independence. Part of the Napoleonic Wars, for at least 8 months of the Spanish War of Independence, Fuengirola's castle here was under the control of French troops, holding the fortress for Napoleon and his brother, who'd been installed onto the Spanish throne at the expense of King Ferdinand VII. Napoleon's occupation of Spain enraged people across the nation, and they soon launched a fierce fight back to restore Ferdinand to the throne and rid the country of Napoleon, in alliance with the armies of Portugal and the United Kingdom, who came to play a major role in the Battle of Fuengirola in 1810. On the 14th of October that year, a huge force of 2,500 British and Spanish troops launched an amphibious landing on the beach just below the castle here, and they set about laying siege to the fortress in the hope of capturing it. The castle, which was then controlled by a joint troop of a few French but mostly Polish soldiers, only had a handful of cannons to fight this immense army off. But unfortunately for the British and the Spanish, after just 2 days of fighting, the siege fell apart, as the British General Lord Blaney was captured and taken prisoner by the Polish, and the attacking forces soon descended into chaos. The Battle of Fuengirola went down as one of the more embarrassing episodes of the Napoleonic Wars for the British, and that's probably one of the reasons that you don't hear about it quite as much as the likes of the Battle of Trafalgar, which was a historic victory just 5 years before. But still, it's a fascinating episode in the lengthy history of the town of Fuengirola, a town that's home to so much more than first meets the eye. Although, sadly, it's here on top of the castle hill that we've now come to the end of our walk around Fuengirola. From its sunny beach to its atmospheric back streets, its historic bullring, and of course the majestic castle, there's plenty to see and do in this delightful Costa del Sol town. Thank you so much, muchas gracias, for watching this video. I really hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you're looking forward to making your own trip to sunny Fuengirola sometime soon.